I've reviewed a lot of Hifiman stuff so far. One of my earliest reviews was the Moondrop HE400i, which was the first planar headphone that I'd ever heard. The general word on the internet was that the HE400i used the same cups and drivers as the original HE400i, and the headband of the HE400 without the i, along with Hifiman's Focus Pad A earpads. Today I'm looking at the HE400i 2020 version, which makes further tweaks to the HE400 platform. So with this new combination of the old HE400i driver, the earpads and the new headband, has Hifiman perfected the HE400i? Well, let's get into it. Hey guys, this is Noel and this is Wheezy Tech. Each week I take a look at a thing and let you know what I think, so if you're into that kind of stuff then make sure you subscribe. Hitting that notification bell also helps out too. Now, in the interests of full disclosure, the HE400i was sent to me on loan by Hifiman. As always, whether I pay for something myself or I get sent a review sample, I'm always going to give you my honest take on them. Also, as usual, timestamps will be in the description if you want to skip to any specific section. So first up, let's just take a look at the physical construction. The most obvious addition to the HE400i 2020 is the new headband design. This is the same headband used on the Hifiman Diva, but using a black leather instead of a light brown. I think this looks much better than the Diva. For comparison, the HE400i used the same old school looking headband as the HE400 and the HE500. Now, I much prefer the looks of this old school looking headband design, but I found it lacking in terms of comfort and adjustability. The original HE400i had an early version of Hifiman's suspended headband design, which was criticised for durability issues. Now, the change to the Diva style headband should solve all of those issues from the previous headband designs. I find this headband to be very comfortable, the clamping force is very light, and the headband has plenty of adjustability. All in, I think that moving to the Diva headband design was a really good choice. The HE400i 2020 uses the same familiar ear cups as the original and the HE400i. These are plastic cups with a mesh grille on the rear side. The earpads are the same Focus Pad design as the original HE400i. Note the difference between the pads on the HE400i and the HE400i. The pads on the 400i are called the Focus Pad A. Both pads are hybrid designs and wedge-shaped, but the Focus Pad A has no internal wall like on the Focus Pad on the 400i. It's important to note that earpads are a significant part of the tuning of any headphone. Therefore, despite having the same drivers and ear cups, the 400i and the 400i will sound slightly different from each other from those pad differences alone. And of course, note that by changing the pads you can also tweak the sound signature yourself to your own taste. Speaking purely about comfort, I much prefer the Focus Pad on the 400i to the Focus Pad A on the 400i. For some reason, the pads on the 400i are kind of itchy and a little bit too soft for my liking. The pads on the 400i have a bit more structure to them, and I just find that they fit my head much better. The cable connection method is the same as on most current Hifiman designs. Connection is dual-sided with 3.5mm mini jacks, length is around 1.2 meters and terminates in an angled 3.5mm mini jack with a push-on 1/4" adapter. The cable itself is braided and not the most flexible cable around. I do prefer a much more flexible cable myself. However, this one isn't microphonic and doesn't cause any vibration noise. Let's briefly cover the specs and pricing, and another giveaway that the HE400i 2020 is still using the same drivers from the original and the 400i. They all use a planar magnetic driver with a single-sided magnet design. The impedance is 35 ohms and the sensitivity is 93 dB. The 400i is not super sensitive and not super easy to drive despite the low impedance. However, it doesn't actually need a power station to drive. Think the O2, the Atom, the Ifi Zendak, or even most mobile phones should drive these with no problem. I've been using these a lot with the Ifi Zendak when I had that one in for review. And lastly, we'll just mention the price, which for these is just $169. This seems rather competitive, with the 400i coming in at around $180 at the time of this review. Time to talk about how they sound then. First up, all specific listening tests were done using lossless sources from a variety of genres using my JDS Atom as the amplifier of choice, although I did spend a fair bit of time using the 400i with the iFi Zen DAC and can as well. And right off the bat, I'm going to say that I really like how the HE400i sounds. Along with the Hifiman Ananda, the 400i is as close to my preferred sound signature as any other headphone that I've ever tried. I had planned to do this review a little while back, but I find it kind of hard when a headphone does really well. There's less to nitpick and I struggle to put it into words. I found the same with the Ananda, a headphone that is so quietly superb. How can I do a proper critique of something that I don't find really puts a foot wrong? And of course, I don't want to come across as a fanboy, but the more Hifiman headphones that I hear, the more I realise that I really like Hifiman's house sound. So in terms of frequency response and overall tonality, we have another rather excellent sounding headphone in the HE400i 2020. If you're like myself and you prefer your headphones to be tuned similarly to the Harman target, then Hifiman always seems to fit in really well. I'll unpack that a little bit more as we go along. So bass rolls off similarly to the Hifiman HE4XX and the Sundara, and also the Sennheiser HD6XX, and basically like most other open back dynamics. It's not super rolled off, but it doesn't have the same extension of the Ananda or most closed back headphones. But when it comes to bass quality, I think, much like the 4XX and the Sundara, it sounds quick and articulate, not as plucky and detailed as the Sundara, to my ears, but more articulate than the 6XX. I've always said that bass is the weak point of the 6XX. The 400i is probably more on par with the AKG K712 Pro than the 6XX. Strangely, I find the bass a little bit more present and more articulate on the 400i than I do the 4XX. As these share the same driver, then I assume this is related to the earpads. However, I measured them both with the Mini DSP ears, and the graphs don't really agree with my assessment. It could be a seal issue with the measurement rig, it could be a seal issue with my own head, it could actually be in my head, or simply a case of volume matching. Now, whilst they do use the same driver, the pads do change the distance of your ear to the driver, and a small change in volume here could be enough to hear a difference. The only real complaint I have with the bass on the 400i is that roll-off. This is not really a reflection of the 400i, but open back headphones in general. However, adding a few dB of EQ, say a shelf at 100Hz, is going to be an entirely subjective thing, of course. However, in terms of bass quality, I'll definitely take the 400i 2020 over the 6XX for sure. Mid-range is a lot less coloured than the HD 6XX. I do like that mid-bass hump for a lot of music, but these days, most of the time, I appreciate the added low-end clarity that the 400i has here. There's a running theme here because I think I said the same thing about just about every other Hifiman headphone that I've tried. Along with the plucky, articulate low end, this gives much more definition and less mud to percussion, to bass guitars. However, they certainly don't have the same energy and punchiness as the Sundara. Upper mids seem a little bit more restrained than the 4XX in a good way. I find the 4XX has a bit of glare in places. Now, both along with a lot of other Hifiman headphones, the 400i has a little recession between 1 kHz and 3 kHz, but the 4XX does seem to have a little bit more energy here, between 1 and 2 kHz. It is perhaps this little bit extra energy that causes the 4XX to sound slightly more shouty, or actually, comparatively, the 4XX vocals even sound a little bit telephonic in places. In my book, this is another win for the 400i versus the 4XX. Just like every other Hifiman headphone I've tried, treble performance is rather excellent, with a good amount of detail reproduction. It's not overly bright, nor too dark. It's another one of those Goldilocks situations. There's more energy and extension than the comparatively veiled HD6XX, but short of being bright and fatiguing. That's not to say that there aren't a few areas that could be tamed. Perhaps some might find issue with the elevation, somewhere around 8 to 9 kHz. This is something the 400i has in common with the 4XX and the Sundara to a degree, but it never really bothered me all that much, and I didn't find them sibilant at all. Your ears may vary. In terms of soundstage, a lot like the Ananda and the 4XX, staging is pretty good. It was one of the first things I noticed about the 4XX when I first tried them, and the 400i is very similar. It's not quite up there with the Ananda, and it's certainly not up there with the K712 Pro, which has a width and depth that I've not heard anywhere else before. but it blows away the likes of the HD6XX. Imaging, however, is a strange one because I always like the imaging of Hifiman planar headphones, at least for getting lost in the music, but when it comes to gaming, I feel that the imaging just doesn't cut it. Instead of being able to place a sound source in 3D space, I feel almost as if the images are mirages. Compare that to a well-imaging dynamic headphone like the Beyerdynamic DT1990 Pro or even the AKG K712 Pro, and there's a night and day difference, particularly in those games where being able to accurately identify the position of a sound is important. For that reason, I can only recommend planars like the HE400i for casual gaming where positional audio is not so important. Something else I want to note is an interesting observation I made between the 400i and the 4XX. Considering they use the same driver and earcup design, I can only assume this is down to differences in the earpads, unless there's something wrong with my 4XX. I find my HE4XX to have an almost reverberant or ringing quality. I mentioned this in my original review of the 4XX, but surprisingly I don't get this at all with the 400i. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what it is that I'm hearing, but the 4XX sounds almost like it is applying reverb, particularly to vocals and guitar leads, for example. I don't know what it is that would cause this, if there's something in the frequency response that would highlight this, but ignoring everything else, for this one reason alone the 400i sounds much better to me than the 4XX. So I think it should be obvious by this point that I really like the HE400i 2020 much more than the HE4XX, despite them sharing a driver. The build is much better, the comfort is a considerable improvement, the headband design in particular much more comfortable, the shape and padding of the earpads is also much preferred, and in terms of sound, whilst they do have a very similar frequency response, I do much prefer the 400i. Whilst not a full bass extension, they do have a decent and articulate bass, clear and detailed mids and highs, with a good treble extension and good sound staging. There really is a lot to like about the 400i 2020. So for $169, are they worth it? Well, let's just take a look at the competition. They've undercut the HE4XX by about $10, so you do the math. The 400i is also much cheaper than the highly recommended Sennheiser HD6XX as well as the new Hifiman HE5XX. What's more, for people outside of the US where dealing with drop can be a bit expensive, the 400i 2020 is simply unquestionably the best value. So what about versus the Deva? I actually really like the Deva, but it's priced in an awkward position. I said in my Deva review, it only really makes sense if you specifically want a Bluetooth planar. My conclusion was that for everyone else, the HD6XX or the Sundara would be better choices. We've already talked about the value of the 400i 2020 versus the 6XX, but the Sundara is obviously the better headphone. It could well be the best headphone under $500, however, the price difference simply rules them out as competition. You also have the AKG K712 Pro, which is a great choice, but only really if you live in Europe, as prices in the US are really quite steep. And there's also the Sennheiser HD560S, but I haven't heard those, so I can't comment on that. So I think you know where this is going by now. With the arrival of the Hifiman HE400i 2020, I am happy to say that this might be the new entry-level mid-fi headphone to beat. And that really actually shocks me to say. Until now, I would have always said that the 6XX is the headphone to beat in the $200-ish price point. I'm going to have to restate this. The Hifiman HE400i 2020 is now, for sure, my sub-$200 headphone to beat. There, I said it. And on that bombshell, I think it's time to end this review. Thank you so much to Hifiman for sending this over for me to check out. Make sure you like, subscribe, and all of that business. Check the cards for other relevant content, and as always, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, have a good one.